Okay, so part two is controllers proper, and what we're going to do is to create a new web app, just while we explore some of these ideas. First thing we want to be able to do is to set up a web app that we can give a query parameter to of name, and we can have it say hello name back at us. So relatively straightforward hello world application basically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new web app. So Grails create app, and I'm going to call it hello world. And I'm going to use this web application to explore a few aspects of controllers. So we come back and we've created our application. So we'll cd, let's do an ls. There's hello world. It's been created for us. So I'm going to cd into hello world. That's the root of my web app. And in class we've been using gedit as our editor for this sort of thing, because it gives us an environment where we can move around quite nicely. So I'm going to say gedit /application properties, and if I hit enter now, it'll run gedit in the foreground. So we'll be able to edit, but we won't be able to type things in. And you might have picked up in class, if you put ampersand at the end of a command, then it'll run in the background, which means you can carry on working in the foreground, and the process you've launched will run in the background. So I do that, and you'll see here's my editor window. And what I'm going to do is just move that to the right so that I can see it there, and I can carry on typing commands in here. That's going to be useful for us. Just looking at this gedit window for a second, I will do a view edit preferences. Let's just up the font size a little bit. Let's go monospace 14. Okay, that's better. And if gedit doesn't look this way, you turn the side panel on by doing view side panel, and this icon at the bottom switches between just a simple list of files and the file system view, which is most useful. It's useful if here you have this set to the root of your web applications or the hello world directory, and then we see our web app laid out for us. If you remember, all the important things for us for now are in the Grails app, and this is where all the model view controller files go. Our view files go under views, our controllers go under controllers, and our domain model goes under domain. So this is where MVC is realized, if you like. And today we're primarily interested in here, in the controllers, but of course we're not going to be able to do very much with controllers if we don't look at views as well. So let's first off do a Grails run app. So Grails downloads any dependencies that have been updated since the last time we ran, and then builds the application for us. Eventually running, and the last line output should give us a URL to browse to. There we go. So we'll say open link, and then if we go to our browser, so this is, as you remember, this is our front page for the application. No controllers installed apart from the default one provided by the application, and late last year we looked at this page and we cleaned it all out and just had an empty page. We're not going to worry about that for now. So we've proved that the application is running. I'm just going to hit Control-C there, which if you remember is cancel in Unix. It'll cancel the current foreground task. So what I want to do is to create a new controller, and I'm going to create a controller called Echo. And the reason that I want to do that is I want to be able to type hello world /echo name equals Ian. Okay, and I want to have it come back. What I'll very briefly do. No, it's okay. Grails create controller is the command that we need. So we've looked so far at Grails create app, and we've looked at Grails create domain class to create classes in our domain structure. This is now how we create controllers. And just again to recap, you can create controllers by hand by just creating the files, but using this command will create the unit tests for us and other bits of housekeeping that just keep our project nicely tied together. So that's why we're using the command rather than creating the files by hand. We need to give it a name, and we're going to create a controller called Echo. So we've learnt about the Grails create controller command there. That's what you need to create your new controllers. When create controller runs, it tells us all the files it's created. So it's created the controller itself. It's created a directory under the views folder called Echo, which is where we'll put the view components for any actions defined by this controller. And it's created as a unit tests file as well. If we look in our editor, you'll see that under controllers, Hello World directory has appeared, and here's our new controller. And if we look under views, we can see that the Echo folder has been created and it's currently empty. So, slightly different example here. We've done it with an Echo controller. This is a register controller, and you can see the class there. Same thing. We're in our package, Hello World. This is the name of the controller. So we said create controller Echo, and it's created as a class called Echo with the addition of controller to the end, so we know essentially what type this class is playing, and it makes the code readable. Basically, we know that this is a controller because it's called a controller. And then it's created as a default index method. So we would like to be able to access URLs, and the basic structure of a URL in most modern applications is controller name, action name, parameters. Okay, so if I've created a controller called Echo, which has a method called, or an action called index in it, then I'd expect to be able to go echo index. Okay, so that's the kind of path that we're creating. This slide is talking about the URL mappings file, and this is background information, but I want to point you to it at the start because this is how this is really working. When I use my browser to go to /echo/index, this mapping, which is the default mapping for all applications, is being invoked, and the application is looking at the URL and saying, does it match any of the patterns in this file? And the pattern defined here is that URLs start with a word, which we're going to map onto a variable called controller, and then they have a slash, and then optionally they can have an action name, and then optionally they can have an ID at the end. So a full controller path would be echo index and then some ID 1 or Fred. Because these are optional, when we say /echo, it just maps to this part. Okay, and this mapping gets invoked, and that's how the framework knows behind the scenes to invoke our Echo controller. So that's what, when we see Echo at the start of a URL, that's how it knows to invoke our Echo class. Now you can add your own mappings to this. If you want to change the way that the URLs are presented, that's how you do it. This is how you control the URL space of your application. In the old days, where we used to write straightforward PHP scripts, the way that the paths were controlled or managed was through the file system. So if we had a directory called /echo/myscript.php, for example, then that's how the operating system would know to direct a request somewhere. We've moved past that now. We don't really use the file system to model our URL space. It's all done through mappings like this. So there's an abstraction between the paths on the URL and the code that gets executed behind the scenes. Don't feel I've explained that particularly well, and you'll only grasp it by experimenting with it. So let's get back to looking at it properly. I've created my Echo controller. I'm going to say Grails run app. If you have a version of Grails which is 2.1 onwards, which the latest web architecture's VMware image does, you can run create controller whilst the application's running, provided you don't need a new URL mapping. We'll come back to that. So I've started the application, and I know that I've got a controller called echo with a method called index. If I refresh this now, Grails now lists the echo controller for us, and you can. It's probably difficult to see on the screencast, but down the bottom corner, this link links to /hello-world/echo/index. I'm going to click this link now, and what I've got back is a 404. Now, what this is telling me is that, although it's not terribly obvious, it's found the controller, but what it's not found is a view component, and this framework will try and look at a number of different files for us. And it's saying, I've looked through the views folder and I can't find anything to show for this controller action, and it's just going to report that this is one of the controller files it can't see. We're going to create .gsp files, not .jsp files. Don't be thrown by that. This error message is saying I couldn't find a view. So what we do is we go to our back to our editor window. We've got echo controller and index, and in our views we've got a folder for echo which is empty. So we'll right click on that and say new file, and because the index that we're creating is called the action we're creating is called index, we create a view with the same name, index, but the suffix .gsp. Now, this is a convention, and the convention is, without being told to do otherwise, a controller action will look for a view file of the same name, and that will be used to render the page. So I've created an index.gsp, and I'm going to put some token HTML in it. Echo index. I save that, go back to my browser. Okay, so I've got my view. Now, if you remember when we were looking at Apache last semester, if you go to / of your website and there are no files there, Apache will look for a file called index.html or index.php, and we basically configure what's called an index page, and the index page is what gets shown when there's nothing else to show. So, if you had a directory full of subdirectories, the index page would be what lets you navigate it. So there's a convention with web architectures that when you don't know what to show, you show an index. What this means for Grails is that if I ask for a controller URL, so just /echo, which is our controller, Grails will still try and execute an action called index behind the scenes. So hello world /echo is the same as hello world /echo /index, and we've got a default action there. What I didn't do in class, and I think it's worth just pointing out now, let me tidy this code up a little bit. Index is still an action, it's just that it's the default action. I'm going to define a second action, def. Let's call it second action. And I'll save that. So the convention is a view component has the same name as the action, but with GSP on the end. So in this echo folder, I'm going to say new file, and this is called second action.gsp. Okay. I'll double click on that to edit it, and I'll just copy this. Save that. And now I'm going to go to, instead of /index, I'm going to go to second action. Okay, so my URL /hello world /echo /second action has used this mapping /hello world. Sorry, /hello world is the application name, /echo is the controller, /second action is the action name, and then we haven't got this optional ID parameter. Now, because the optional ID parameter is only adding words, I could actually say /Fred on the end. I get exactly the same thing, it's just that this final ID parameter has been bound. So that's showing you how action names map to views. Yeah, in our controller we now have two actions, index and second action, and we've got some views for those actions. Back to what we were doing in class. What we did in class was, under the index method, we say println params, and I was explaining to you that when a request comes in on a URL, an instance of this controller class is created, and it has members set which are hidden from you, because otherwise this class would be overloaded with lots of things about the web request. So we just want the controller to be as lightweight as we possibly can, but it does have these variables that you can access as member variables, and one of them is this map called params, which is a map of all the URL parameters and any form parameters. You need to read the Grails documentation to see what other variables are available, but there are things like request and response, which map very cleanly onto the request and the response that gets sent back to the browser. So we can look at things like request headers using the request object. For now though, what I'm just going to do is to say println params. So I save that, and I'm going to go back to my echo URL, which is going to invoke the index action. The difference now is I've got this message that says here's the map for the params, and the only parameter which is set is controller echo. The fact that controller has been set to echo is actually a result of this. When this mapping is bound onto our request, if you like, it said, oh, okay, so the first part of the URL is echo, so I'm going to set controller to be the value from the URL. So that's how we know what controller has been executed. And if we say echo /index, then we'll see now we've got action set to index as well. So that this is telling us about the URL. Params is all about the information being sent to us from the browser. So we've got some information coming in. Remember how we had the /ID part that was optional? If I used Fred as an ID component in the URL, I'd have ID as Fred. So you can see that in the params object, the bindings from this mapping are giving us some information about what's coming from the URL. And indeed, I could say /flibble ? Here, and if I put /flibble in the URL, that would come through as well. So this is how we can build up the URL space for our application. If you cast your mind back to that cool URLs document about URLs being guessable, we don't want to be too free and easy with our URL space. It's quite nice that we've got a static pattern, but this is the place where we define what that policy is, that pattern for our application. So it's right that it's not free and easy. We don't have different URLs all over the place, but you know, there is some consistent methodology, if you like, to the URLs on our site, and this is where we set it. Ordinarily, I wouldn't suggest you mess with this particular layout. There are reasons why you might want to, but ordinarily, let's leave it with the default for now. We've looked at how URL parameters get bound into params for the path. Now we're going to look at the query string. So the query string on a URL is question mark and then name value pairs. So I could say name equals Ian. Okay. Back at the output from our controller, I've now got name Ian. Okay, and ID Fred. So let's do another one. Let's say role equals instructor. And I'm going to get rid of these extra parts on the URL for no particular reason, just to demonstrate the principle, I guess. So now we've got this slightly cleaner thing. Name is Ian, role is instructor, controller is the echo controller. So that's how we can pass parameters into our application, and something which I talked about in the lecture but didn't particularly discuss in part 1 of the screencast is one of the other ways to access the params map in Groovy is it will give you a dot notation as well. If the object that I'm talking to happens to be a map and Grails doesn't recognize the command, so I can remove things from a map by saying params.remove. So if there's a method, then Groovy will execute the method. But if there isn't a method, Groovy will actually say, oh, is this a value in the map instead? So I can say params.name. Let's go back. So I've got name is Ian there. And you can see that it's output the contents of the map and its output Ian. So params.name is Ian in this case. This is a feature of most dynamic languages. It's particularly prevalent in Groovy and in Ruby, and it makes for quite clean looking code, because obviously the alternative is params and then I use the array accessor. This is, strictly speaking, better and it's more efficient. So we're going to stick with that, but I did want to show you that you could use the dot accessor for the map as well. It's a nice feature. It's particularly useful where you have lots of nested maps, so I can say params dot some structure dot some substructure dot some substructure dot value. It's slightly more concise. Anyway, I digress. We've shown how to get values into the controller action, but what we really need to be able to do is we need to be able to access these in our view. Now, when our view is rendered, so remember this is a template, this isn't actually a static HTML page. As it happens, Groovy will make available all the parameters to our view component as well. So we can just say h2 hello, and the templating convention is $ curly brace name close curly brace, and our view template has an object inserted into it called params as well. So why don't I just say that for now? In the same way that we did println params, I'm going to say hello params there, and when I rerun this, okay, so this is quite nice, isn't it? Param2 equals Fred. Okay, so you can see now that I'm dumping out the URL part again here, or all the information we've derived from it. But our original goal here was to say hello and then the name parameter. Using the dot accessor, params.name. So that's quite nice, isn't it? I mean, that's certainly it's quite terse. There's not lots of extraneous syntax there, but to be right, let's use the fuller version. Same effect, different syntax. You're going to have to choose for yourselves which is better. The only downside to using the .name accessor, you have to remember that params is an object, and underneath this there's an object-oriented programming language. And the way that this .accessor is working is by trying to execute a method, or saying, is there a method called name on this already? No, there isn't. In that case, I know that this is a map. I'm going to see if there's a key in the map with this name. Compare that. So when the framework sees params.name, the process it goes through is to say, is there a method called .name on this? Oh, no, there isn't. Therefore, I'm going to look in the map itself and see if there is a key with the value of name, and if there is, I'll return the mapping part of that. Contrast that with using an array accessor. It's immediately obvious to the compiler that you are trying to access a value in this map, and it goes straight to the values. So it's more efficient. given the speed of modern CPUs, is it really efficient enough? Is the efficiency trade-off better than the readability of that? Because we all know what we mean by that. We mean name from the map. So the only slight confusion arises if you want a key in your map that is also a method name, and that's a problem, because obviously if I have something in my map called remove, then the framework doesn't know if by saying that I mean the remove method or a value called remove in the map. So this is more readable, makes for better code, but also slightly ambiguous in some circumstances. That's explicit and is more functional. You will have to form your own opinion about which you should use. I digress. We've wired together our URL, and we've now gained access to those URL parameters in the view. If all we could do were echo parameters we passed on the URL, that would be pretty rubbish, wouldn't it, actually? And we need to do some processing. So what we said in class was, well, in a database type application, you probably wouldn't know somebody's name, but you might know their user ID. And what we might do is we might say echo, so hello world echo index. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say ID equals 10. So I'm going to emulate an application where instead of our controller just passing values through, our controller is going to take the ID, assume it's the ID of a user, do a lookup, and then find out the name from the database. Because this lecture is about controllers and not about accessing the database, we're going to mock that up. We're going to pretend it's happening in the background. But we're going to look at this. Now, a quick note about what's happened here. I've not specified a name parameter, hello, and then no value, because no names come through. Name equals Fred. Hello, Fred. Take away name equals Fred. We don't have anything. So our controller now needs to do some work, because we have params.id, and somehow we need to turn that into a name. So what we're going to say is I'm going to declare a response array. This is where I'm going to put the results of my operation. So def result equals an empty map. Okay, and here is where I do my database lookup for user ID. Okay, so some code that we'll discover in coming weeks for actually interacting with the database, and what I get back from that is a user, and as a result of that I can say result dot, in fact let's do it properly, result user name equals Ian. In fact, let's say Ian plus params.id. So this is going to set username to be Ian and then the value we pass in for ID. Just, so you can see what's going on. So our controller is starting to do work now. It's starting to do logic, even if it's just mocked logic. We need to pass values back from this controller to the view, and we do that by returning a result map. So I'm just going to return the map in this case. What happens is the values that I return are going to be merged with all the other things available to this request and made available to our view. So in the same way that we can access params as an object and we can access response and request as objects, I'm going to be able to access anything I put in this map at the root level of my view. So in my view I can say hello, oops, right, username. So by setting username here, I can access a variable called username in my page. So I go back to my page here, I refresh this. Okay, I set ID to 10 and I've got hello Ian 10 back. Controller gets mapped and executed. We print some information. We mock up a database lookup for ID 10. We set a result variable called username to be Ian space and then the ID from the parameter, and then we return this map, which makes that variable available in the view, and we can use it to display some information. Hello username. I deliberately chose ID as a parameter because if you remember in this mapping, ID is also available as a part of the URL before the query string. So why don't I just pass in this as a part of the URL instead? Same result. And this is why for cool URLs this is quite nice, being able to pass in user IDs as a part of the URL rather than query string parameters. Also helps with the web caching infrastructure of the internet. So it's actually, I've identified a resource which is echo index 473, and then I can put some parameters on the end as well if I like, you know. It doesn't matter, but this URL now identifies a resource, and this is quite a nice way of building up cool URLs. This is a solid URL structure for our site and something we need to be aiming for. This is explaining how URLs get mapped onto that. So I've talked about this, and again this slide is how we access a view from a request. Here's an example view. More information about query strings and returning parameters. I think we've been through all this, and then I've suggested that you create a standalone application called calc which adds 2 parameters. So to do that you would need to use the Grails create app command. You would create a new controller, so Grails create controller calc, and then you'd add an action called add and add some parameters called A and B. Now the only thing that I wanted to say in addition to that, just to warn you in advance, is in class what we did was, supposing that I think ID should be an integer, and to prove to you what the result should be, I'm going to say result square bracket ID times 10 is equal to params.id times 10. So I'm setting a property that can be used in the view called id times 10 here, and in the view I'm going to say a new paragraph tag this time, and my paragraph says, hey, id times 10 is id times 10. Save that. Yeah. So I'm going to say hello username, and then I'm going to say, oh, by the way, the ID you've passed in on the URL or as a parameter times 10 is this value. So I've passed in 473 here. I'm going to hit enter, and what I get back is what I expected, you know, all our lookup code or our mocked up lookup code. But then I get this text here. Sorry, why don't I make this bigger? Instead of getting 4,730, I couldn't even times a number by 10 then. What I get back is the string 473 multiplied or repeated 10 times. And the reason for that is that Groovy, as an object-oriented language, has very kindly said, it has no way of knowing whether or not this is a string 473 or an integer 473, and so values in the params map are always strings. So we always have a key, which is the parameter, and then a value, which is a string. Groovy has overloaded the multiply operator on a string for us and said that when you multiply a string by 10, what you're asking for is for that string to be repeated 10 times, which is quite useful actually in certain circumstances, but it does point out this thing that we need to be quite aware of data types when we're doing operations. And in class, what I discussed was I said params.id times 10. I think that's the way that I did it first. So we should get exactly the same result. Yeah. So the way that we fix this, the way we actually get an integer value, and obviously you're going to be doing a calc controller. So if you're doing a calc controller, you're going to need to be able to get integers. And so the bit of black magic you'll need to know is that there's a class called integer, and it has a method called parseInt, which is used to parse a string into an int value. So what was suggested was you could use this, and that should get us the value that we think is right. 4,000. That's correct. But the problem with this is that if I omit this, if I don't put an ID parameter in, my whole application blows up. And the reason for that is that I'm asking integer parseInt to now parse something which doesn't exist, which is a null value. And this demonstrates why we shouldn't have application logic in our view, because we need to put a lot of defensive code around this functionality, and the view isn't the right place for it. So we shouldn't be doing this kind of work in our view. Our view is for display. So this is how we ended up in class, with the work being done in our controller in this way. And what we said was, if params.id, so if it's present, then set this to be the result of parsing the ID into an integer and multiplying it by 10. And then I said otherwise, so the parameter wasn't set, I can say, copy this because I'm lazy, is params.id was not set. So I save that, and then instead of doing the work in my view, so my controller has arranged for a response parameter of id times 10 to be set regardless of the input scenario. If I run this again now with no ID, I get params.id was not set, or I could use the URL mapping, or I could use $ID equals. Yeah, they all work okay. So I think that's as much as I want to do for this week. Do some trivial experimentation with this kind of thing. Create yourself an app, create yourself a calc controller, do some additions of integers, do some multiplication and some divisions, or other simple use cases, and I think that will be really good progress for this week. So if you've got any questions, you know where to find me, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.